my first bachelor's degree was a Bachelor of Science degree, but I always had a real interest in architecture, and particularly in the conservation aspect of architecture. I had a second bachelor's degree, and then in 1972, I was participating in a survey of haciendas and ranchos in the Valley of Oaxaca, Mexico. And that was my really first introduction, 1972. That was my first real introduction to adobe, or basically mud brick architecture. I was fascinated by it. I was also fascinated not only by just the construction systems, but indigenous repair techniques, and also failure patterns. Particularly as someone interested basically in preservation, the failure patterns became very, very interesting to me. The way a wall would fall might determine whether it was basically compromised by moisture, lower wall moisture, or maybe it wasn't compromised but simply fell from severe ground motion. That really fascinated me. So 72, at the time I was working on my master's degree actually, but that sort of sealed the direction I wanted to go. I went to work with the National Park Service in 1974 when I finished my graduate degree in architecture with a specialty in historic preservation. And my specialty geographically was Mexico, Spanish colonial architecture, and architecture of Mesoamerica. So when I first went to work for the Park Service, my supervisor at that time approached me and said, we've got this project, it's in Tumacacori, which was a Spanish colonial site in southern Arizona, which I was very familiar with. And I always laughed, and he said, "Oh, is that the way you pronounce it?" I said, yeah, it was originally a Jesuit site, and then he said, "Oh, well then, it's your project if you want it." So that, the site in Tumacacori in southern Arizona was a Spanish colonial mud brick structure. And at the time when I became project architect, it had some failure issues, some plaster falling off the walls. And the National Park Service decided this was a good time to do a non-research type project, since the National Park Service doesn't do research. But at the time, they then contracted with the National Bureau of Standards to begin to look at the characteristics of mud brick. It was used particularly well in the Southwest. And so that was very fortunate for me that I happened to be the project architect at the site that they were concentrating on. So that was very interesting. They were looking at material characteristics, strength, deformation patterns, how the material is affected by moisture, what about soluble salts, all those things that we know about that affect the stability of earthen architecture, of earthen building systems. One funny thing was that we were, one of the publications came out, one of their first ones. To start off, the lead sentence began with, "In many parts of the world, earth is used as a building material in lieu of conventional methods." I thought that was so curious because obviously in many parts of the world, it is a conventional method and material. But so that was, but we went on. But what it did, though, it got a lot of, for me, exposure to the international community, because no one else was doing that kind of basic research. And then you're looking back on it, the research was pretty superficial, if you will, but still it was something was being done. And so even while I was with the Park Service, that really introduced me to the international community. And I began to be invited to teach, and went to for the third International Congress on Earth Architecture in Turkey in 1980. There'd been two previous ones in Iran, 1972 and 1973. But this began that series that we're still within today, these Earth Architecture Congresses, which occur every 4 years, depending on political and various other conditions. In the 90s, the Rome Center, which did a series of intensive preservation courses for architects, for painting specialists, for mural painting, and I was teaching at some of at the Earth Architecture, and sitting on the front row was a gentleman that he, after one of my lectures, he said, "Come here, I want to show you some pictures." And it was Bill Remsen. He was working for RC at the time, and had some pictures of the Shunit, El Zabib, some early photographs, and that was 1974. So I looked at the photographs, and then Bill began to explain what this structure was, and it was immense. Walls were still 12 meters tall, 5 meters thick. I'd never seen monumental architecture like that before. And the Shunit El Zabib is at Abydos, and then I began to understand learn more about the history, particularly when I became involved a few years later. So that was in the mid-90s. Then in 2000, Bill Remsen contacted me and he said, "We have a project, I think, at the Shuna. Would you be interested in participating?" So that was my initial participation in the conservation program at the Shuna in Abydos. And that began in 2000. The site had been it was being documented by a Polish team, and Bill and I and a structural engineer went to the site and just began to try to understand the site, what some of the problems might be. And then we all wrote reports, and that was combined in a report that was basically given to Dr. Adams, Matthew Adams, who was the site director at the time. And then the next year we went back, and I had developed a set of specifications for we anticipated the conservation work would be, and Bill and I went back and sort of began to test them to see if it was doing it the way I would outline in the specifications was going to be appropriate at the Shuna. But it wasn't until 2004 that we actually had the first project. And I don't remember, I think it's probably a 6 weeks project, and then that was in the spring of 2000, and there we began to concentrate on some of the major structural issues that existed. And those structural issues were primarily the fascinating history of the site, of course, because it was reoccupied by a Coptic community in the first part of the first millennium AD. And consequently, they would hollow out the walls. You think about it, how's the best way you want to create space, living space? Well, you got this, huge walls of mud brick, and it's pretty easy to dig into it, so let's do that. So there was a series of seven Coptic cells that were hollowed out of the walls. Of course, over the years, those collapsed. So those were major structural issues. So that was sort of the first thing we began to work on. So that year was 2004, the spring, again in 2000, the fall, again in 2005. And then by that time, we had really stabilized all those major issues being the Coptic cells. And then it wasn't until 2009 or 10 that we had another project at the Shuna. During that time, we also, the issues basically were not only just the supporting walls that were unsupported, time because of some of these collapses. But also delaminations, you had a large section of walls were basically pulling apart from the mass. We had basically you had 4 walls that were basically freestanding walls, and those were structural issues. The structure, as you know, had 4 main entrances into it. 2 entrances pretty complex, 2 not so much. But in all cases, we looked at those entrances. One of them had partially collapsed again on the west side, leaving just a huge gap between 2 freestanding walls. And over the time, what had begun to happen is those freestanding walls began to slowly delaminate because there was not anything to support. So there was always a series of structural cracks. So one thing we did was then begin to look at, okay, how do we obviously have to support those 2 freestanding walls. How do we do that? So we looked at, contemporary shoring and bracing, but our whole concept of the schooner was to protect it as a ruin and to continue whatever we did would evoke that same character of that as a ruin. That was sort of the driving force. And we went back and I was proposing that back in 2000. But this is when we really began to execute that particular approach. And as you know, so one thing we did, of course, filled up. We had the basic footprint of that west entrance, so that was pretty easy. But in both sides, there'd been Coptic cells. So of course, part of it was how do we protect that? That's part of the important part of the history, the Coptic part of the history. How do we protect that? We were going to fill them all back up. We were going to put new mud bricks all over. So we would typically had a process that we would stabilize the plaster that would remain, and then protect it or isolate it with clean sand before we did anything else. So right today, if you'd go back and excavate that area, remove all that, thousands of mud bricks that we added into that particular area, what you would find is that plaster remains of those Coptic cells, hopefully just the way we found them. But that process then pretty much continued. One fascinating thing to me is these are small mud bricks. Typically those early appearances of Second Dynasty, the mud bricks were about 27 centimeters, about 13 centimeters by about 8 centimeters to 9 to 10 centimeters thick. That was pretty small. We even on the site, there were mud bricks stacked from the original construction in the Second Dynasty. There were mugmaras, or mud pits, that were where mud mortar was mixed. It was what the archaeologists were excavating, and of course they were all there. It was fascinating. Our mugmaras, where we mixed new mud, of course looked exactly the same as those done historically. That was pretty fascinating. But we did a lot of testing, and I think this is something that we always have to be aware of when we address issues with existing, particular ancient sites. We would like to have all materials be able to perform in the standards that we would like. So many compressive strength, tensile strength, etc. of the bricks, as well as the structural system. Well, but you're dealing with what exists. So we did a lot of field testing of just simple field testing of compressive strength, tensile strength, shake tests to determine the basic ingredients, the aggregate, silt components, the clay components, and then we also sent those materials to a lab in New Mexico. Why did you send it to a lab in New Mexico? That brings up another question, but in fact that's where they did it. Interestingly, they did compressive tests, and they obviously on the old bricks, the compressive tests were not particularly, they would not meet contemporary standards, let's just say. one of the big issues of the existing mud bricks was the amount of organic material that was used to construct them, to make the bricks originally. So they were all like completely eaten away with insects over 4,800 years. So that was a big issue. It was a big issue also in deciding what we wanted to do and the bricks we were going to use for the conservation aspect. And you can see with the way I'm describing it, it was sort of an ongoing process as well. You know, you'd learn something, you'd do something else. But the point, this is an important point. So whereas the compressive, for instance, compressive strength, and that's the main one we were dealing with, because we were going to put a lot more mud bricks on the existing mud bricks. And let's just say if you were looking at it from an engineering standpoint, you'd want a safety factor of 2.5 or 3 to 1. Well, our safety factor was probably 0.9 to 1. So in other words, it looked like probably the compressive strength would not deform under whatever the amount of bricks we were and the weight we were adding to it. But the point is, if they did, so what? You didn't have any choice. So they did deform some. And I think that's some really important conservation issues that we always have to deal with. We can't recreate a situation that doesn't exist. We have to deal with what exists. But, so that was, again, the process. Now, a lot of the conservation work was basically for filling voids that were compromising the integrity of a larger portion of a wall. Some of it was to try to look at delaminated portions. Some of it was anticipating what might be failure patterns in the future. For instance, a lot of animals, foxes, making dens under walls. Hornets was a huge problem. Hornet nests, some of them might be a small entrance of maybe 20 centimeters by 20 centimeters, and then the void created by those hornets might be a void of a cubic meter in the wall. So those were obviously problems we needed to deal with. So again, our strategy continued to evolve as we looked and tried to understand the structure. For instance, the eastern wall had been severely undercut. Mariette in 1850s had dug a very deep trench on the interior of the interior of the structure and didn't fill it. And of course, that whole east wall began to lean and begin to delaminate, and portions of it began to fall into the trench. I think also, as you remember, that east wall was a very low wall. The other walls, there were spots in them that were a little lower than others, but basically the whole east wall, or let's say the central part of the east wall, was probably the highest was maybe 4 meters, where all the rest of the walls were anywhere from 8 to 10 to 11 or 12 meters. I'm very convinced that Dr. Adams was thinking that was part of the collapse pattern. That wasn't what I'm convinced that was just simply a matter of you had a site with building materials and you had local community that needed building materials. I think that whole wall was probably taken down, or most of it. The part that was missing was taken down and reused in the villages. There was one section of wall on the southwest corner. It was just a big gap. It was on the top of a big sandbank. And I think that was, again, an evidence of the fact that this was salvage materials. People could climb up that sandbank easily and begin to salvage. So those were just factors we continued had to deal with. Some of the walls, particularly the east wall, because of its condition, we built the top of the wall, essentially protecting the top of the wall from erosion, or sacrificial layers at the top. I think that's something we really have to think about, particularly these ancient sites. I didn't do that any other place. For instance, the west wall. we thought about going up and clearing a section so we would be able to establish a sacrificial layer. But, you know, in Shuna, given an estimate of the amount of upper wall erosion that had taken place, I calculated that over a 4,800-year period, the average erosion on the tops of the wall was probably 1 millimeter per year. Okay, so if we go to this wall and remove debris from the top of the wall, get a nice flat surface so you can put new bricks on, how much of a normal erosion process are we eliminating? So, and basically on that wall, I think I calculated that we are looking at maybe removing 200 or 300 years of normal erosion to put our protective cap on the wall. I think that's something in particular, as I say, these ancient sites, the rate of erosion, the history, the length of the building's been there. An architect might plan on an intervention lasting 10 years, 20 years, 50 years. You can't think like that in these archaeological sites. You have to think much more long term. You have to also think about things that are going to change in the next 5, 10 lifetimes that you're trying to, conservation issues you're trying to address. Let me just say that in the world we live in now, in Egypt, working at these archaeological sites now, it's changed, and it's changed for the best. That we always have a much more integrated, in projects I work on, we have a much more integrated team of professionals that are all contributing equally. So basically the work that needs to be done still at the Shuna, we basically restored, I think, the portion of the northeast gateway and the southeast gateway that's now perfectly understandable of the what the experience would have been for someone, a priest or whoever would have been entering that compound, that complex. What the going through a misdirected visual. You know, you could walk in one, you face a blank wall, you have to turn this way, you face another blank. So that was a design. That was designed when you would walk outside, then there would be a different kind of impression. Those have now been done. We started doing stabilization work on the southwest gateway, and structurally it's sound, but it's not well presented so it could be interpreted. The whole south wall has not been worked on, so there's still a lot of undercuts. It's not unstable except for maybe portions of bricks that would fall here and there, and that's a safety issue. The last time I was working at the Shuna was 2019, and that's when we finished the southeast gateway, but also began to address a lot more of those safety issues. One of the problems always had been people accessing the tops of the walls, and there was one particular area that was accessible to the tops of the wall, and we made sure that we rebuilt a portion of that so it wouldn't. Some of these young people can climb up anything, but basically to try to eliminate easy access to the tops of the walls or those areas that would be more susceptible to traffic decay. The future, I think the perimeter walls, some of them have been stabilized. The west perimeter walls particularly, some of them are in very poor condition. And I think the future that the work needs to be done at Shuna, the south wall, and also the perimeter walls. Of course, in the future, interpretation is going to be so important there. I don't know, if we can effectively address that in the future, but that's certainly something so important. that it can be understood the way I understand it and the way you understand it. Working on this, of course, opened up opportunities for me to work on other sites in Egypt. In, I think, 2015 or 2016, I was asked to participate in work at Malkata, which was one of most Amenhotep III's Sedheb, probably one of his Sedheb palaces. It had been reused several times. So there were some standing walls and a lot of low walls that defined the whole compound. The palace, the throne room, but a lot of ancillary walls as well. Now, probably, as you well know, probably one of the more important things there is amazing amounts of painted ceilings that had collapsed. And of course, in any time that we're working to stabilize a wall, it's got to be preceded by archaeological investigations to understand what we may be impacting. So it's always, and I think this is a perfect example where conservation work, and I talked about this a few years ago in Grenoble on a paper looking at the consequences of conservation. And one of them is that, of course, we have to be responsible for our actions, but also we have to be responsible to other disciplines. Architectural conservation is not a discipline that operates independently. I don't think I've ever worked on a project anywhere, whether it was in Egypt or anywhere else, that there wasn't a strong archaeological component, which was necessary. There's always a process of discovery going on. Certainly Malkata was an example of that. It was there again in terms of trying to stabilize, basic stabilization in some of the main definitive parts of the palace was the first priority. So a lot of that was simply capping, putting sacrificial layers on walls, repairing walls that were undercut. Pretty basic work. But also the throne room, that area that the team decided needed to be more emphasized, and that added to more, let's say, basically reconstruction, just on a base wall to rise it up a few courses higher so that it could be seen at a distance. For instance, when you entered the site from the south, would that be the south? No, northwest, isn't it? Yeah, on dimension, I get my directions mixed up. From the northwest, you entered the site, and basically, historically, the way you entered the site, you wouldn't see any of that, except you might see a larger portion. But we felt like to raise that a few more courses would emphasize that, so as you approach the site, you'd at least know that this is an important area. Now, is that conservation? No, that was partial restoration. But I would like, I need to say, there's no preservation project that doesn't have components of restoration, stabilization, conservation in it. A restoration project doesn't have just the restoration, it has all those components. So Malkata, unfortunately, the project, I always like to leave a project, at least if I never go back or the team never approaches the site again, at least it's understandable and it's protected. I think Malkata, that wasn't necessarily quite the case. I think there was work that needed to be done. A lot of walls that were not addressed that are continuing to erode today. Another site that I was honored to participate in was the Deir el-Balalas, which was basically the period that was constructed at the end of or latter part of the second intermediate period. It was, again, a fascinating place, not only for the type of construction, but for me, my God, there were bricks there that I'd never seen in Egypt, bricks that size. what were they, 55 centimeters by 27 centimeters by 18 centimeters. They were huge. Compare that with what we first saw at the Shuna, which were 27. The largest dimension was 27. So they were like 8 times larger in volume. So that was pretty interesting. And the site director, was began to explain to me the significance of the construction system, which was basically a casemate or cellular construction system, where there was a series of mud brick walls that were constructed, and intersecting walls were added to support those walls, and then the interstices were filled with debris, basically to establish a platform. That was both at the North Palace, which was the site of these very large bricks, but also they used that same system on the South Palace to basically build up a hill. And I don't know where it was all from a visual standpoint, or where the hill looked more like a structure, but I'm sure that's what happened, or whether that was intended or not, or certainly to stabilize the hill, where you use the same casemate structures, not for individual spaces created for any kind of use, but simply as a structural element to, in that case, hold up the natural angle of repose of the hill. In the other case, in North Palace, it was specifically to support superstructure. The other part, there was in the South Palace, there was a wonderful stairway, several staircases, and trying to interpret exactly how those existed originally and how they were to be protected was important. Then I was involved in just part of the ancillary structure, basically housing units that were near the North Palace. And that was basically, again, just trying to stabilize and to some degree trying to protect what was there so that it could be interpreted in the future. I remember, for instance, one example, which no one would ever see right now, would be there was a part of, not a silo, what am I trying to say, a circular cylindrical storage unit. We had I don't know, maybe a few centimeters, 20, 30 centimeters of it left, and that had been re-excavated. So it was, how do we do to protect that? You can't put a protective cap on it. You can't mud plaster it. So we basically, that was an example. We tried to encase it and protect it. We encased it with new mud bricks on both sides and filled in the space between that actually came in contact with the walls of that original cylindrical feature, just to protect it, and then basically covered it up again. So sometime in the future, hopefully, if it's re-excavated, what we found in 2019 would still be there. One of my first trips to Abydos, I think that was back in the early, maybe 2002 or 3 or 4. I remember it was 2004, I remember. We took a brief tour, just arrived in on the plane and came in the next day. And the site director said, we're just going to take an hour tour or so up into the South Cemetery. I think Joseph Wagner had worked, so we looking at. One thing that fascinated me there was some of the reuse of materials. Again, I mentioned the reuse, salvaging the building materials earlier at the Shuna, and I think that's pretty consistent in a lot of places, and it makes sense. But I remember there that Joseph was showing us some ancient walls that had been basically, the walls had been scooped out, so that in their case it wasn't reusing building materials, it was using the mud bricks for agricultural purposes. That was pretty fascinating to me. So that was my first introduction to that sort of area of Abydos. Unfortunately, it turned out to be not a great introduction because we didn't stay out an hour, we stayed out about 3 hours. I did not have a hat, and I got mild sunstroke. And in fact, that evening, my temperature went up to 104. And I remember telling the site director, I said, all right now, trying to be very clear and logical about this. So now, when I die, the phone number you have will not reach my wife, so I'll need to give you another number so you can reach her. You can reach her. Luckily, I survived. But that was my first introduction to the South Cemetery. Later on, this has been 2021, I guess, or, well, yeah. And then, no, 2022, I was contacted by a colleague that had responsibility at a site, a very interesting site, at the South Cemetery, area of the South Cemetery, associated with ICOMOS the First. And he had built his own pyramid, which was now just a tall mound of earth. And he had also then constructed a small, basically a cult type pyramid for his grandmother. And that fascinated me because I was very attached to one of my grandmothers, for sure. So I thought this was a great thing that somebody would construct a pyramid for their granny. It was a fascinating structure because, again, because it was not a solid mud brick construction. It was not stone, it was mud brick, but it was, again, cellular or casemate type construction. And it was fascinating to try to understand exactly how that would work in a pyramidal shape. It's, to me, as an architect, it's pretty, understanding geometry was understandable in one sense, but how would that work when you had sloping walls? If you did, and we did. But we certainly utilized information that had been produced before in 1902 by Corelli. We had a basic site plan, but very inaccurate. A lot of the walls weren't even represented. It was excavated again in 2004 and 2010. We had that information as a basis to begin with. But the original concept, and this was original, that the Ministry of Tourism and Antiquities wanted to present this ruin, this site, this archaeological site, be able to stabilize it, protect it, and present it as a part of a larger plan to look at the Abydos area and try to emphasize more the importance of Abydos. I think for all of us that have ever worked there, it struck us that such an incredibly important area, incredible amount of sites, and amazing significance that is underappreciated. I have a colleague that I recently worked with, and she went to Egypt and went to Abydos, and she was talking about it, and I said, well, did you get out to the Shuna? What's that? She went to the Seti Temple, of course. That was the only thing she saw. So that was fascinating also from that standpoint. But our original, as I say, our instructions, or at least this is what we felt, was to protect what was there, excavate it, understand it, document it, try to understand what the significance of this structure truly is. So that was the goal we set out to do, and the first season was a short season for me. Was the fall of 2022 was simply to re-excavate the site, try to understand what was there and how we would protect it, and try to present it in the future. The future then was spring of 2023, where we actually did just that. Stabilized walls, walls that were deformed, undercut, replaced some of those missing features and areas, and then try to protect and try to understand the things that make what makes a pyramid a pyramid. Size. Let me ask you, what are the two things? Size and the slope of the walls, right? So that was the first thing to try to understand what the size of the Teddy Sherry structure was. Stephen, previously it had been measured at 23 meters on the side, but the corners weren't well defined, so that was the first thing we needed to do, is try to understand where the corners were, begin to understand and be able to define the actual site. That was a challenge, honestly, but we, with a lot of great contributions by our masons, we were able to do that, and by the surveyors, we were able to do that, and basically it's about the same size, but 24 meters, within 24.07, 24.05, but it's all 24 meters. And the other thing was the slope. What is the slope? Is it previously it had been estimated at about 54 or 58 degrees, based on measurements of the poridium that was found in the debris. But you know, as a fragment, and how you exactly measure the angle based on, I don't know. Interesting enough, we measured a different, we rested the pyramidion on probably on a different surface, and the angle was 63 degrees. So, but in basically though, the defining feature of the slope of the wall was the interior surface. And the exterior walls were corbelled from the outside, step back each layer until you reached the height you wanted to reach. Interestingly enough, of course, that was eroded. So you really had to try to understand how much erosion had taken place. If you had a header brick that was 30 centimeters left, obviously 10 meters had eroded. So those calculations were important. But the main thing was that I don't know that previously the investigations had really looked at the interior of those exterior walls, the interior surface, and they were corbelled as well. Of course, because they were better protected, the angle was more clear. So based on that and reevaluation of the exterior slope and the erosion taking place, I think we're pretty comfortable that the slope was not 58 degrees, but was 63 degrees. The 63 degree angle slope translates into a slope ratio of 2 to 1. In other words, it's twice as high it was wide. So that meant basically a 24 centimeter or meter base, or approximately 80 feet, would mean a height of the same. So I think we're all pretty comfortable with that the original construction was about 80 feet tall, or 24 meters tall. What we don't know is there was the two interior spaces, a wonderful kind of an entrance that we at least had the footprint of, and we knew the ratio of that entrance area to the sloping walls, but how high it went, we didn't know. And this was an interesting thing too, that the masons said, all right, we need to bring this up, let's say another half a meter, so they can understand it. So they, of course, brought it up as you typically would, and it was flat. And I came and said, you know, the impression now, if I'm approaching the site, that was the height of the pier, and it wasn't. We don't know how high it went. So that was another thing that we always had to keep in mind. Walls that were partial walls, we wanted to make sure if it was the top of a wall, that's the way we presented it, as the top of a wall. Of course, in this case, there were no tops of the walls. We only had 2 meters of walls. Some of the walls would have been, I don't know how many meters tall. I think, so in doing that, I think, to me, looking back at that project, which is relatively new, the important thing was that a lot of things we did not understand about the pyramid. But the things that we did understand, we presented, but we left all the physical information exactly as we found it. In other words, if we kept a wall that was leaning, and there were plenty of leaning walls, deformed walls, split open walls, we protected them exactly as they appeared to us. So that if you go to that site and your interpretation is different than mine, that's fine, because you've got the same information there that I had. My interpretation may be one thing, you may have another one. But the important thing is that what we did not reflect my interpretation. It reflected what was there, intact, what we found, and that was available for you to find. Any project that I was working on, fortunate to work on in Egypt, I was first I always needed somebody to help me. We needed to have somebody readily doing documentation. It was exactly what we were doing. And when I'm directing the work, and I'm a pretty hands-on person, I may be hauling bricks at times. I may be sitting there with a trowel and I want it done this way, and here, let's lay a few bricks. Let me lay out a few bricks and show you what I want to do. So I'm pretty hands-on. So a lot of the documentation is so important to know, so that the future knows exactly what we did. So I always needed, didn't always happen, but I always needed to have some assistance in primarily doing that part of the project, the documentation part. But I always felt this is ridiculous for me to be the only one here that's understanding this, or my conservative friend from California that's going to assist me here. We need Egyptians to be my assistant. We need Egyptians here to be able to understand what the process is, what their understanding is, to carry this into the future. It's not my goal would be that at some point I'm not needed. That would be, honestly, that would be my optimum goal as a conservative. I'm no longer needed here. Now at my age, how long, that hopefully that will be done, but I'm fortunate enough probably to still be able to work in Egypt. But I think the Tertiary project was very important because we did have, for the first time, we had 2 Egyptian conservators who were responsible for doing the documentation, and our inspector that worked for the ministry was also one of our top masons. And I think that he is one example of someone that can carry this whole concept of preservation of mud brick architecture into the future. But we have to have that. I know that there's for important reasons. There's mud brick architecture is undervalued, and I don't know that there's so many significant sites in Egypt. I don't know that can ever change. But what we have to do is, as we can, emphasize how important mud brick architecture is. Before Saqqara, there were no stone was not used for buildings. It was all earthen architecture. It was all mud brick. So not only is it so important in the history of Egyptian architecture and archaeology, it's important in the future to try to protect what remains. And of course, we're losing parts of that heritage all along. And this is a heritage that maybe I'm biased because this is my field of work, but it is undervalued. And the goal of trying to continue to work closely and develop the expertise locally with training programs, but more important than just training programs, its own site experience with real life projects is so important. The international community continues to develop principles to try to help those that are not directly involved in the preservation of earthen architecture, to guide them. I'm recently been involved in standing specialized committee on earth architecture of ICOMOS, in developing a charter for earth architecture. You'll probably laugh, but we just finished our 10th review of the charter. The charter has been a product of 8 people working intensely for 4 years. It's 3 pages long. But it's a major step. Of course, from that, it's not a guideline. It's just basically an understanding of basic principles. Hopefully that will be approved by ICOMOS in the fall of this year in Malaysia.